I didn't scream when I saw my mother kissing my husband through the sunroom glass. I just raised my phone, recorded the betrayal, and called the only person who could understand. 10 minutes later, my father's SUV rolled into the driveway, but the first person out wasn't him. It was the woman my mother spent a decade erasing from our lives, carrying a document box ready to burn down my marriage and my mother's social empire. My name is Janet Spencer. I am 36 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have made a highly lucrative living managing disasters. As the Director of Crisis Communications for Halcyon Meridian Health, my daily routine involves mitigating catastrophic surgical errors, silencing leaked executive scandals, and spinning corporate hemorrhages into acceptable quarterly losses. I know exactly how human beings behave when the floor drops out from under them. Most people scream, some weep, a few freeze in pure, unadulterated terror. I never imagined I would get the chance to observe my own biological response to an absolute, world-shattering catastrophe. My flight from Nashville landed 3 hours earlier than scheduled because a high-level board meeting evaporated overnight. I did not text my husband to let him know I was in a car heading back to our suburban enclave. Reed Callahan, at 38, was a commercial real estate broker who survived on his immaculately tailored suits, his blindingly white smile, and his silver tongue. He loved surprises, or at least, he always claimed he did. Instead of walking up the front driveway and dragging my rolling suitcase over the cobblestones where the noise would announce my arrival, I left my luggage in the garage. I walked around the side of the house, letting my heels sink slightly into the soft, manicured mulch of the side garden. The afternoon light was spilling across the lawn in long, golden sheets. The house was quiet, too quiet. I approached the large glass panes of the sunroom, expecting to see Reed lounging on the sofa, perhaps reviewing contracts with a glass of scotch in hand. Reed was there, standing near the center island of the sunroom. But he was not alone. My breath caught in my throat, stopping dead behind my ribs. He was not reviewing contracts. His hands, the hands that had slipped a platinum band onto my finger 5 years ago, were currently resting firmly on the narrow waist of a woman wearing a familiar cream silk dress. He leaned down. She tilted her head up. Their lips met in a deep, practiced, desperate kiss. It was the dress that gave it away first. I had bought that cream silk dress for her last Christmas. The woman pressing her body against my husband was Evelyn Spencer. My mother, a normal wife, a normal daughter, would have shattered the glass. She would have pounded her fists against the pane, screamed until her vocal cords tore, and demanded answers right then and there. But I did not knock. I did not burst into tears. I did not make a single sound. The crisis manager inside me took the wheel. In a crisis, emotion is a liability. Evidence is currency. With movements so smooth, they felt entirely detached from my own body. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone. I swiped open the camera, switched to video mode, and pressed record. The lens did not judge. It only documented. I held my hand perfectly still, leaning slightly against the brick framing of the window. I panned the camera slowly across the room. I captured the way Reed's hand slid lower on her back. I captured the way my mother's fingers tangled in the collar of his expensive dress shirt. I recorded the unmistakable, undeniable reality of their intimacy. It was not a drunken mistake. The relaxed slope of their shoulders, the seamless rhythm of their embrace, this was an established routine. Through the screen of my phone, I zoomed in closer. My focus shifted from their entangled bodies to the low glass table situated right behind them. There was a stack of thick manila folders sitting on the polished glass. The top folder was clearly marked with the logo for the upcoming charity gala. Next to the folders rested a heavy cardboard blueprint tube. Its plastic cap popped off. But what truly sent a spike of ice straight into my veins was the object sitting next to the blueprints. A heavy brass keyring, the keys to Juniper Point Inn. My grandmother had left that lakeside inn to me, and only me, when she passed away. It was my heritage, my safe haven, and supposedly entirely off limits to Evelyn. I kept recording. The lens captured the brass keys gleaming in the late afternoon sun. As the red recording timer ticked upward, pieces of the past 6 months began clicking together in my mind with the sickening precision of a loaded gun. My mother had been relentlessly pushing me to take on more out-of-state conferences. "You need to secure your position, Janet," she would say, sipping tea in my kitchen. "You need to be indispensable." Meanwhile, Reed had developed a sudden, obsessive interest in my daily calendar. He needed to know exactly which flight I was on, exactly what time my meetings ended, and exactly how many nights I would be sleeping in a hotel room 2,000 miles away. And the chorus they both sang, over and over, whenever I looked tired. "You are working too hard. Janet, you are so stressed. You need a long rest. Your mental health is deteriorating." They were not expressing concern. They were building a narrative. A dark, suffocating memory from my childhood floated to the surface of my mind. I was 12 years old, standing in a dressing room, wearing a dress I loved. Evelyn had looked at me in the mirror, her eyes cold and calculating, and told me I looked foolish. She never looked at me like a child who needed nurturing. Evelyn looked at me the way a queen looks at a younger, threatening princess. I was never a daughter to her. I was competition. I was a rival who needed to be constantly diminished, controlled, and kept in her place. I had survived my mother by keeping my distance. I had survived by building a life of my own, with a husband I thought was mine. I was wrong. I had invited the enemy into my bed. The video reached 3 solid minutes. It was enough. It was more than enough. I lowered the phone and tapped the red square to stop the recording. I took one last look at the two of them, still oblivious, still whispering against each other's mouths in the sunroom of the house I paid the mortgage on. I stepped backward, placing my feet carefully on the flagstones to avoid snapping any twigs. I retreated from the glass, moving silently until I reached the dense, towering yew hedges that lined the edge of our long driveway. The thick green branches swallowed me up, hiding me from the house entirely. I leaned my back against the rough bark of a yew trunk. The air felt thin. My chest tightened, but I refused to let the panic win. I opened my contacts, scrolled past Reed's name, past Evelyn's name, and tapped the number for Arthur Spencer, my father. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Janet," his voice came through the speaker, deep and steady. "I thought you were in Nashville until tomorrow." I did not offer a greeting. I did not soften the blow. "I just recorded Mom kissing my husband inside my house," I said. My voice sounded completely hollow, as if the words belonged to someone else. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for 3, maybe 4 seconds. I could hear the faint sound of a turn signal clicking in the background of his car. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice was not filled with shock. It was not filled with rage. It was completely chillingly calm. "Do not go inside," he said, his tone dropping an octave. "Do not let them see you. I am coming in 10 minutes, and this time, you will want to see everything to the end." The crunch of heavy tires over the asphalt broke the stifling silence of the yard. I stayed pressed against the rough bark of the yew tree, my breathing shallow. A sleek black sport utility vehicle glided into the driveway, stopping just short of the garage doors. I instantly recognized my father's car, but the driver's side door remained firmly shut. Instead, the rear passenger door swung open. A pair of sharp, black leather boots stepped onto the driveway. I braced myself for a family friend, perhaps a corporate lawyer my father kept on retainer, but the woman who stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored charcoal trench coat, made my lungs seize. It was Clara Hale, my father's older sister, my Aunt Clara. She had not set foot in our zip code for exactly 11 years. Not since the explosive Thanksgiving dinner where she looked Evelyn dead in the eye, called her a social parasite, and walked out the front door without looking back. Clara's hair was completely silver now, cut into a severe, immaculate bob, and her face held the kind of grim, unyielding determination usually reserved for executioners. Behind her, a younger man scrambled out of the other side of the vehicle. He wore a slightly rumpled navy suit and thick-rimmed glasses, clutching a heavy slate-gray bank archival box to his chest as if it contained a live explosive. I recognized him from a brief real estate seminar years ago. Noah Briggs, a senior title and escrow advisor at Breyer Title and Abstract. Why would my father bring a commercial real estate expert to a domestic crisis? My father finally stepped out of the driver's seat. His face was a mask of carved granite. He walked past the front of the house without a single glance toward the sunroom windows, leading Clara and Noah straight to the secluded edge of the driveway where I was hiding in the shadows. "You are early," my father said softly, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of a breakdown. "I thought you were in Nashville until tomorrow evening." I shook my head, my mind still struggling to process the presence of my estranged aunt. "My board meeting was canceled. Dad, why is Clara here? Why is Noah holding a bank box?" Clara did not offer a warm family reunion. She did not reach out to hug me or offer hollow sympathies. She simply stepped forward and rested her gloved hand on the heavy gray box. "We were already on our way to find you, Janet," Clara stated, her voice as crisp and dry as winter air. "Long before you called your father about the disgusting display happening inside your sunroom." "Find me for what?" I asked, my professional instincts flaring up. My father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. There is a scheduled closing to finalize the sale of Juniper Point Inn." The words hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. "What are you talking about? I never listed the inn. I own it." 100%. "We know," Clara said, "but the buyer does not. And according to the paperwork filed with the county clerk 48 hours ago, you are not the one signing the transfer deed tomorrow. Evelyn is—" The world tilted slightly on its axis. I looked at the gray box. Noah swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses before setting the box down on the flat stone retaining wall bordering the driveway. He popped the lid off. Clara reached inside and withdrew a thick, uncomfortably official-looking stack of legal documents. She flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. "This is a petition for an emergency medical power of attorney," Clara explained, her manicured finger tapping the center of the first page. "Filed quietly, practically in the dark, the grounds severe mental exhaustion. Chronic insomnia, dependence on prescription sleep aids." It paints a very convincing, clinically endorsed picture of a woman who has completely lost the capacity to manage a multi-million-dollar commercial asset. I stared at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. My name was everywhere, paired with words like incapacitated, unstable, and overwhelmed. "Who authorized this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a cold rage that was rapidly replacing my initial shock. Noah pulled out a second folder, his hands slightly shaking. "That is the worst part. Mrs. Callahan. We flagged this during the final title review because the chain of authorization looked unusually expedited." He turned a page toward me. "This is the electronic signature authorization for the transfer of management rights. It has your digital signature, and the digital authentication log confirms it was executed from the primary Internet Protocol address registered to this exact property. Your home network." I looked back toward the sprawling brick house. "Someone stood inside my own living room and signed my legacy away using my own internet connection." "Someone who lives there," Clara corrected sharply. "Someone who knows your schedule, knows your passwords, and has access to your devices while you are deep asleep." I looked at my father. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "Reed has been having lunch with me twice a month for the past half year," Arthur said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "He kept bringing up the inn, saying it was bleeding money, saying it was a massive anchor dragging you down. He told me he wanted to save you from financial ruin, but that you were too stubborn and too attached to let it go." "And Evelyn," Clara chimed in, stepping closer to me. "Your mother has been doing the exact same thing on the social circuit, planting seeds, whispering to the Heritage Board members that you are cold, detached, and utterly unfit to maintain a historical family property. She has been building a public consensus that you are having a mental breakdown, Clara gestured vaguely toward the garage, where I had left my luggage. Your sudden business trip to Nashville was not a convenient coincidence. Janet, Reed and Evelyn needed you out of the state this exact week. The Heritage Gala at Juniper Point is approaching. They needed you gone so they could push this sale through in total silence, lock the funds into an offshore or joint account, and present you with a legally binding done deal when you returned. A sickening, terrifying clarity washed over me. The puzzle pieces I had been staring at blindly for months finally locked together into a horrifying, monstrous picture. The constant suggestions that I take a leave of absence from my demanding job. The way Reed always poured my evening glass of wine, insisting I needed to relax, often accompanied by a sleeping pill he conveniently left on my nightstand. He was not caring for me. He was sedating me. He was building a medical paper trail. The video on my phone, the undeniable proof of their physical affair, suddenly felt like a minor footnote. The kiss I had witnessed through the sunroom glass was just the cheap, glossy paint covering a meticulously engineered demolition. My mother was not just sleeping with my husband. That was merely a physical symptom of their twisted alliance. They were actively working together, combining her ruthless social maneuvering with his financial access to completely erase me from my own life. They wanted to steal my grandmother's legacy, drain my assets, and gaslight the entire world into believing I was too crazy to stop them. I unlocked the front door of my own home, the brass key feeling unnervingly cold against my palm. The heavy oak door swung inward on completely silent hinges. The four of us stepped into the vaulted foyer, like a team of forensic investigators crossing the yellow tape of a freshly secured crime scene. The air conditioning was running, circulating the familiar, expensive scent of my bergamot reed diffusers, but beneath it lingered something entirely foreign. It was the cloying, heavy scent of my mother's signature French perfume. We moved in perfect, synchronized silence toward the open-concept living room. The afternoon light poured through the massive windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Reed and Evelyn had moved from the sunroom. Reed was standing near the center of the living area, frantically tugging at the collar of his tailored blue dress shirt, his fingers fumbling blindly to fasten the top button. Evelyn was stationed 10 feet away by the brass bar cart, her posture rigid, her manicured hand resting too casually on the neck of a crystal bourbon decanter. They had managed to create physical distance between them in the short time it took us to walk from the driveway, a practiced maneuver of two people used to hiding. When Reed looked up and saw the four of us standing shoulder to shoulder in the entryway, the blood drained from his face with alarming speed. He looked past me, his eyes widening as they landed on my father, and then on Clara, a woman he had only ever seen in old, discarded family photographs. "Janet," Reed choked out. His voice cracked, a high-pitched sound of pure panic. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands raised palms out in a desperate, placating gesture. "Arthur, what are you all doing here? We thought you were staying in Nashville until late tomorrow night." He did not wait for anyone to answer. The silence radiating from our side of the room was too dense, too lethal. He immediately launched into the clumsy, pathetic script he must have kept in his back pocket for a moment like this. "Listen, it is not what it looks like," Reed stammered, pointing a shaking finger toward Evelyn. "Your mother came over because she was completely frantic. She was having a severe panic attack about her marriage with Arthur. She was crying. She was falling apart right there in the sunroom, and I was just holding her. I was just comforting her." I did not argue. I did not waste a single breath dismantling his transparent, insulting lie. I walked right past him. I felt the fabric of his sleeve brush against my blazer, and I felt nothing but clinical disgust. I moved straight to the polished marble surface of the kitchen island. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and opened the video gallery. I dragged the volume slider all the way up to its maximum limit. I set the phone face up on the cold marble, right next to a bowl of decorative lemons, and pressed play. The audio filled the quiet, expansive room. There was no denying what it was. The heavy, unmistakable sound of wet mouths moving together, the frantic rustle of Evelyn's silk dress sliding against Reed's slacks, the low guttural sigh escaping Reed's throat. It was the undeniable acoustic signature of two people entirely consumed by a forbidden, practiced intimacy. Evelyn's fingers slipped. The heavy crystal decanter clinked sharply against the glass shelf of the bar cart. But my mother was a creature forged in the fires of country club politics and high society warfare. She did not collapse. She did not beg for forgiveness. Instead, she straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked at me with an expression of profound, maternal disappointment. "You are being incredibly theatrical, Janet," Evelyn said, adopting the condescending, sing-song tone she used to scold me when I was a difficult child. "You always do this. You spend your entire professional life managing corporate disasters, so you project a state of crisis onto everything around you. You are taking a very vulnerable, very confusing moment out of context. You are purposely twisting this just so you can play the victim again." Clara stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. She walked purposefully to the long oak dining table adjacent to the kitchen. She lifted the heavy stack of legal documents Noah had handed her and dropped them onto the wood. The loud, flat thud echoed against the high ceiling like a gavel striking a block. "Let us talk about context, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of absolute menace. Clara did not look at Evelyn. She methodically dealt the documents across the polished oak surface, spreading them out like a dealer at a high-stakes table. A petition for temporary power of attorney, a medical declaration of diminished capacity, a drafted prospectus for the immediate liquidation of Juniper Point Inn, and a formal, legally binding notice effectively stripping Janet of all asset management rights. Reed stared at the papers spread across our dining table. His jaw locked tightly. The pathetic, comforting son-in-law persona evaporated into thin air, replaced by the cold, calculating commercial broker I recognized all too well. Noah, sweating visibly but clinging desperately to his professional obligations, stepped forward. He pointed a trembling finger at the final page Clara had exposed. "The electronic signature attached to the transfer deed," Noah stated, his voice tight and formal. "It was authorized using a two-factor authentication protocol. We pulled the digital logs. That authorization code was requested and verified through the local area network of this exact house. Someone stood inside these walls, used the smart home control center or a recognized personal laptop, and forged Mrs. Callahan's legal consent." Reed crossed his arms over his chest. He abandoned the panic entirely. He switched tactics, leaning hard into the pragmatic, sensible husband routine. "That ancient inn is a decaying money pit, Janet," Reed said, his voice dripping with forced reason. "It is bleeding your accounts dry. You refuse to see the reality because you are too attached to your grandmother's ghost. The sale is moving forward to protect you from your own emotional, irrational decisions. You are completely exhausted. You cannot even manage your own sleep schedule anymore, let alone a failing hospitality business." I looked down at the medical declaration Clara had placed on the table. My eyes scanned the dense, formal paragraphs until they locked onto a specific bulleted list near the bottom of the second page. It detailed my erratic working hours. It detailed my supposed mood swings. And it listed the exact, highly specific chemical name of the prescription sleep aid I took. I only kept those pills in one single place in the world. They were hidden inside the false bottom of a vintage cedar box, shoved all the way to the back of the bottom drawer in my bedside table. I had never spoken the name of that medication out loud to Reed. I had never swallowed a pill while he was in the room. A new, suffocating wave of violation crashed over me, far worse than the image of the kiss. He had not just monitored my travel schedule. He had meticulously invaded my most private, vulnerable sanctuary. He had spent months digging through my nightstand while I was at the office, cataloging my private medical information, and building a psychological profile to use as a weapon against me. He had weaponized the very bedroom we shared. My father had remained standing silently near the archway, watching the entire psychological bloodbath unfold with eyes that resembled frozen lakes. He finally took 2 slow, deliberate steps into the center of the room. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of his presence made Evelyn flinch and take a physical step backward. Arthur looked at his wife of nearly 4 decades, the woman who had just tried to orchestrate the destruction of their only child. Then he turned his head and looked at the man who had stood at an altar and sworn to protect me. "Adultery is the dirtiest thing my daughter saw today," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper that froze the air in the room. "But it is not the most dangerous." Clara did not let the suffocating silence hold. Her gloved hands moved methodically over the polished oak table, sorting the nightmare into neat, devastating piles of evidence. She pushed a thick stack of printed correspondences toward me. The top sheet bore the ornate letterhead of the local Historical Preservation Society. "Your mother has been laying the groundwork for this execution for over 8 months, Clara stated, her voice as hard and unforgiving as concrete. "She sent these private messages to 6 key members of the Heritage Board. She detailed your supposed decline. She claimed you were suffering from severe insomnia, exhibiting erratic behavior, and that the sheer burden of managing a historical asset was pushing you toward a complete psychological collapse." I picked up the first email. The date was from late October. Evelyn had written that I was tragically overwhelmed and entirely unable to separate reality from workplace stress. She had woven a narrative of maternal concern so thick and sugary it made my stomach physically turn. Reed scoffed, crossing his arms tighter across his chest, feigning exasperation. "It is not a lie. Janet, look at yourself objectively for 1 second. You work 80-hour weeks. You live on airplanes. You barely sleep." Clara completely ignored his pathetic attempt to interrupt. She slid a glossy 8x10 photograph out from a manila sleeve and dropped it on top of the emails. It was a picture of me. I was slumped against the armrest of our living room sofa, my mouth slightly open, my face pale, my hair tangled. I immediately recognized the heavy gray sweater I was wearing. It was from the 2nd week of February, the night the regional hospital network faced a massive data breach. I had been awake for 48 straight hours managing the international press fallout. I had collapsed on the sofa at 4 a.m, my laptop still burning hot on the coffee table, but the laptop was not in the frame. The towering stack of crisis management files was not in the frame. The empty coffee mugs were not in the frame. Reed had angled the camera and framed the shot tightly, completely cropping out every single piece of professional context. He had turned a moment of sheer, hard-earned physical exhaustion from a high-stakes corporate job into a portrait of a woman who looked heavily medicated, unhinged, and completely incapable of functioning in normal society. Clara flipped through 5 more photos just like it. Me sleeping on the patio chair in the backyard. Me resting my eyes in the passenger seat of his car after a brutal flight. A meticulously curated gallery of my manufactured incompetence, all taken by the man who was supposed to be my partner. Then, my eyes landed on a sheet of heavy, cream-colored medical stationery. It bore the crest of a highly exclusive private psychiatric practice located in the city. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Harrison, a man who frequently played mixed doubles tennis with my mother at the country club every 2nd Tuesday of the month. The document was titled as a preliminary psychological assessment. It cited observed conversational detachment and alarming signs of acute emotional burnout. "He wrote this official assessment after the charity gala dinner last spring," Clara explained, tapping the signature. "A formal medical evaluation based entirely on sitting across from you while eating roasted chicken and drinking champagne. Evelyn convinced him it was a necessary first step to get you the desperate psychiatric help you supposedly needed, completely bypassing any actual clinical protocols. But the final blow, the one that completely severed my soul from my physical body, was buried on the 4th page of the legal petition." I read a paragraph that quoted my own internal, agonizing fears about balancing my demanding career and my grandmother's sprawling legacy. The wording was incredibly, undeniably specific. It mentioned my deep-seated fear of failing the strong women who came before me. I had never spoken those exact words out loud to anyone. I had never whispered them in the dark. I had written them in a small, leather-bound therapy journal I kept hidden under my thick winter sweaters in the very back corner of my closet. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They had not just monitored my digital footprint or casually searched my nightstand. They had methodically, ruthlessly hunted through my deepest, most guarded physical spaces. They had stolen my private pain, twisted the context until it was unrecognizable, and pasted it into a sterile legal document to prove I was mentally unfit to manage my own property. They had not merely spied on me. They had built an entirely counterfeit identity of me and dressed it up in my stolen, violated words. Reed took a step toward the dining table, his tone shifting into something revoltingly gentle. He put on the voice of a reasonable mediator trying to calm a hysterical client. "Janet, if you just stop fighting and cooperate with us, this can all go so smoothly," Reed coaxed, his hands open. "The buyer is offering a massive premium price for the land, $2 million above the current market value. We finalize the sale of Juniper Point, and we take a large portion of that money to send you on a long, luxurious, much-needed vacation. 6 months in Europe, maybe a full year. We will announce to the board and all our friends that it was a joint family decision to prioritize your well-being. No ugly scandals, no public fighting. Everyone wins. You get your massive cut of the real estate commission. My mother gets her high society vanity project funded, and I get quietly institutionalized on a European beach," I replied, my voice devoid of any inflection. The words tasted like cold ash in my mouth. Evelyn lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious superiority. She realized the sympathetic, concerned mother routine was completely dead, so she unsheathed her actual weapon. "You should think very carefully before you throw a tantrum and ruin everything, Janet," Evelyn warned, her voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings. "You seem to forget the name on the primary deed of the very ground you are standing on right now. This house, your beautiful suburban sanctuary, is part of the broader marital estate. Arthur and I co-own the primary holding company that manages this mortgage. If you decide to make a public spectacle of this, if you refuse to see reason and force a messy legal war, the first person forced to pack their bags and vacate the premises might not be me." It was the ultimate, calculated threat. "Submit silently to the theft of your legacy, or be rendered completely homeless by the woman who gave birth to you." Reed looked entirely pleased by this revelation. He stood a little taller, visibly waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces. He waited for the tears to fall, for the screaming to start, for the desperate pleading to begin. Instead of breaking, a terrifying, absolute calm descended over my mind, freezing my veins. The corporate crisis manager took complete control of my nervous system. I did not say a single word in response to her threat. I turned my back on them and walked away from the dining table. I moved with deliberate, measured steps toward my home office alcove situated just off the main kitchen. I unplugged my heavy work laptop from its docking station and slid it into my large leather tote bag. I opened the bottom drawer of the heavy steel filing cabinet, bypassed the useless decoy folders, and retrieved the small, fireproof combination lockbox containing my passport, my birth certificate, and my grandmother's original handwritten will. I placed the metal box carefully into the bag. Finally, I walked back into the kitchen area. Evelyn and Reed watched my movements in total silence, clearly unnerved by my complete lack of hysterics. I opened the upper cabinet right next to the stove. I reached past the expensive spice racks and pulled out a battered, faded tin box decorated with painted yellow daisies. It was my grandmother's recipe box, the only tangible item from Juniper Point I kept in my personal kitchen. I placed it gently into my tote alongside the legal documents. I slipped the heavy bag onto my shoulder. I looked at Arthur and Clara. They were already moving toward the front door. Understanding the silent command in my eyes, I did not look back at my husband. I did not look back at my mother. I walked out of the house. I did not walk out like a defeated, broken woman being exiled from her own home. I walked out like a seasoned veteran exiting a burning building, knowing exactly how to return with the demolition crew to finish the job and salt the earth behind them. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, severing me from the life I thought I knew, the final, agonizing truth settled deep into my bones. The most devastating betrayal of the day was not the physical sight of their lips touching behind the sunroom glass. Physical infidelity was pedestrian. It was tragically common. What my mother and my husband had done was profoundly evil. They had spent months coordinating a psychological assassination. They had worked tirelessly together to strip away my voice, my dignity, and my legal autonomy, piece by piece, all while looking me directly in the eye and telling me they loved me. Clara's law practice occupied the top floor of a restored 19th-century textile mill in the heart of the downtown district. The heavy steel elevator doors opened directly into an expansive attic space defined by exposed red brick walls, thick iron support beams, and a massive reclaimed wood conference table that dominated the center of the room. The air smelled of old paper, bitter coffee, and the sterile hum of commercial data servers. It did not look like a place where broken families went to heal. It looked exactly like a place where they went to wage war. I dropped my heavy leather tote bag onto the long table and immediately stripped off my blazer. The shock that had carried me out of my marital home was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a hyper-focused, lethal adrenaline. I was no longer a betrayed wife stumbling through a domestic nightmare. I was the director of crisis communications facing a hostile, coordinated corporate takeover. I found a large rolling whiteboard tucked in the far corner of the office and dragged it to the head of the conference table. I grabbed a fistful of black dry erase markers, a stack of sticky notes, and a box of pushpins. I began building the architecture of my own attempted ruin. I wrote down dates, perfectly aligning my out-of-state business trips with Reed's supposedly busy weekends. I pinned up the fabricated medical evaluation Clara had taken from my dining room. I charted out Evelyn's relentless social calendar leading up to the Heritage Gala. I drew sharp, dark lines connecting their private schedules to the systematic dismantling of my public reputation. Noah Briggs unpacked his laptop and connected it to Clara's secure network. His fingers flew across the keyboard with frantic precision. Within 20 minutes, he found the first structural pillar of their fraud. I wondered why you never responded to the preliminary title inquiries sent out by the county clerk over the past few months, Noah said, adjusting his thick glasses as he stared at a digital municipal record. Your mother submitted a formal change of address form for all legal correspondences related to your estate exactly 7 months ago. She rerouted everything to a private post office box 2 towns over, registered under a shell entity she called the Lakeside Heritage Conservation Fund. You never saw the legal warnings because they never reached your physical mailbox. Arthur sat at the far end of the long wooden table, his phone pressed hard against his ear. He was speaking in low, rapid tones to his private wealth manager. When he finally ended the call, he placed the device face down on the wood. He looked utterly exhausted, yet his eyes burned with a terrifying clarity. "The family trust," Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. Evelyn could not initiate the asset transfer without the master authentication code for the estate holding accounts. I keep that code inside the biometric safe in my home office. I just checked the access logs. She did not hack the system. She bypassed it entirely. 3 years ago, I opened the safe to update our life insurance policies. She must have stood right behind me and memorized the sequence. Or perhaps she photographed the master ledger when I turned my back to answer a call. She has been holding on to that stolen bullet for 36 months, just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to fire. "It gets worse," Noah interrupted, his voice dropping an octave as he opened a new encrypted file. "Reed did not just rely on your mother's social maneuvering to push this through. He needed immediate liquid capital to grease the wheels for this rapid closing. He opened a massive collateralized loan against your personal line of credit 90 days ago. He borrowed $250,000. Clara leaned over Noah's shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "A loan of that size requires verbal confirmation. The bank would mandate a secure phone interview. They did, Noah replied, pulling up a digital audio transcript provided by the fraud department. The bank recorded the verification call. A female voice answered the phone, confirmed your social security number, confirmed your mother's maiden name, and officially approved the line of credit. It was a crude, desperate tactic, but it was just enough to clear the first automated security gate. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. The female voice on that recording was undeniably Evelyn. She had sat in a quiet room, picked up a telephone, and calmly impersonated her own daughter to steal my financial identity and fund my husband's betrayal. Clara sifted through the stack of printed emails and prospectus drafts she had confiscated from my house. "We need to look closely at the buyer," Clara commanded, tapping a glossy brochure with her manicured fingernail. "Solstice Haven Retreats. They operate high-end, extremely exclusive wellness facilities for ultra-wealthy clients seeking private rehabilitation." I walked over and looked at the executive summary page Clara was holding. The name of the chief executive officer was printed in bold letters at the bottom of the sheet. Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance, I read aloud, the name leaving an acidic taste in my mouth. He was Reed's fraternity brother in college. They still play golf together every single spring. And look at the firm handling the public relations and zoning permits for Solstice Haven, Clara added, pointing to a small, elegant logo stamped in the corner of the document. Sterling Associates, the managing partner of that firm, is your mother's absolute best friend on the charity committee. It was a completely closed loop. A perfectly orchestrated inside job masked as a legitimate real estate transaction. I grabbed the heavy cardboard tube we had found in the sunroom, pulled out the architectural blueprints, and unrolled them across the wooden table, using heavy coffee mugs to pin down the curling corners. Evelyn had been parading around our town, soliciting donations and sympathy under the guise of saving a historical landmark. She told everyone the sale was a desperate conservation effort to rescue a failing business. But the blueprints told a completely different, horrifying story. The intricate architectural drawings outlined a massive demolition plan. They were going to bulldoze the original wraparound porches. They were going to tear down the historic carriage house. The rose garden where my grandmother had taught me how to prune bushes was labeled as a future concrete valet turnaround. They planned to gut the entire main building, leaving only a hollow wooden facade, and construct a massive, sterile, glass and steel compound in its place. They were going to wipe Juniper Point off the map and erase every single thing my grandmother had built over her 70 years of life. I stood up and backed away from the table. The air in the attic felt suddenly charged, heavy with a new kind of gravity, the cold. Corporate logic in my brain merged with something much deeper, something ancient and fiercely protective. This was no longer just a messy divorce. It was no longer a standard family betrayal over money. This was a war for survival. If they succeeded tomorrow morning, they would not just steal my property. They would terminate the employment of 30 loyal staff members who relied on the inn to feed their families. They would destroy Sadie Monroe, the manager who had taught me how to balance a ledger when I was 15 years old. They were going to pave over my history to build a monument to their own phenomenal greed. I walked back to the whiteboard. I picked up the thick black marker. The chaotic web of timelines, photographs, and legal documents stared back at me, a monument to their deception. I used an eraser to clear a small, clean rectangular section right in the center of the board. The anger inside me condensed from a raging, uncontrollable fire into a sharp, unbreakable diamond. I pressed the marker against the pristine white surface and wrote a single, defining directive for the war we were about to wage. Do not block with emotion. Destroy with evidence and timing. The fog was still clinging heavily to the surface of the lake when Clara and I pulled up to the service entrance of Juniper Point Inn at 6 a.m. The air smelled of damp pine needles and old wood, a scent that instantly transported me back to summers spent running across these very floorboards. The inn was a sprawling Victorian estate, an architectural masterpiece of deep mahogany and wraparound porches that my grandmother had fiercely protected her entire life. Now, it stood in the gray morning light like a wounded animal waiting for the final blow. Sadie Monroe was waiting for us in the industrial kitchen. Sadie had been the general manager for over 2 decades. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her hands were trembling slightly as she clutched a steaming mug of coffee. She looked terrified, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if expecting Evelyn to materialize from the shadows. But beneath the fear, there was a hardened resolve. She was tired of the silence. She was ready to speak. "I am so sorry, Janet," Sadie whispered, her voice cracking as she placed the mug on the stainless steel counter. "Your mother told all the staff you were recovering at a private facility. She said you were not to be disturbed under any circumstances. But things have been happening here, things I could not ignore anymore." Sadie led us down the narrow, creaking corridor toward the back storage rooms. The scent of beeswax and cedar gave way to the sharp, sterile smell of packing tape and cardboard. She unlocked the heavy oak door to the overflow storage, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was packed with my grandmother's antique furniture, the handcrafted cherrywood sideboards, the velvet armchairs from the main parlor, the brass reading lamps that had illuminated the library for half a century. Every single piece was wrapped in thick plastic and slapped with a bright yellow shipping tag. I walked over to a stack of framed oil paintings leaning against the wall. The tags read, "Liquidation Asset, Lot Number 4. They were inventorying my heritage, cataloging my memories to be sold off to the highest bidder, and I had never signed a single authorization. "It is not just the furniture," Sadie said, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. She pulled a thick, leather-bound internal ledger from her apron pocket and handed it to me. "It is the rooms and the money." I opened the heavy book. It was the internal expense tracker, a secondary log Sadie kept separate from the main accounting software. I scanned the handwritten columns. "Suite 3, Sadie stated, her voice tight with disgust. "The private cottage down by the water. For the past 4 months, your mother and Reed have booked it for the entire weekend, at least twice a month. Evelyn always put it in the system as a closed-door partner meeting to discuss the Heritage Gala. She explicitly ordered the housekeeping staff to stay away. No room service. No cleaning until they were completely gone." My stomach churned, a cold wave of nausea washing over me. They were not just sleeping together in my marital bed. They were conducting their vile, secret romance in the most sacred, secluded corner of my family's legacy. "Look at the expense columns," Clara instructed, pointing a gloved finger at the ledger. I read the numbers. Thousands of dollars drained directly from the Juniper Point Maintenance Fund. The money meant to repair the slate roof and restore the porch railings had been diverted. It was used to pay for cases of imported vintage wine, massive arrangements of white orchids, and private catering from the city. Evelyn was literally financing her illicit affair with her daughter's husband, using the operational lifeblood of the inn she was actively trying to destroy. It was textbook self-dealing, a blatant, undeniable misappropriation of trust funds. I handed the ledger to Clara and walked out of the storage room, marching straight toward the east wing. I needed to stand in the one place where Evelyn's poison had never been allowed to seep. I opened the door to my grandmother's old office. It had remained untouched since the day she died. The heavy mahogany desk sat in the center, bathed in the pale morning light filtering through the lace curtains. I walked behind the desk and opened the bottom right drawer. Inside, resting next to a stack of yellowed stationery, was a bulky, ancient desktop dictaphone. I pressed the clunky playback button. A loud hiss of static filled the quiet room, followed by the gravelly, unmistakable voice of Thomas Vance, my grandmother's fiercely loyal, late accountant. "This is for the record," the recorded voice rasped. "Evelyn is circling the property again. She views this inn as a piggy bank, not a legacy. If I am gone, and if Evelyn ever attempts to utilize Juniper Point assets for her own personal, exclusive benefit, you must invoke the contingency. You must bring Clara back immediately. Do not wait." The message clicked off. The room fell into a heavy, profound silence. My grandmother had known. She had seen the absolute core of Evelyn's greed decades ago, long before I was even born. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the faded tin recipe box I had taken from my kitchen. I opened the lid, pushing aside the handwritten index cards for blueberry scones and roasted chicken, until my fingers brushed against cold metal at the very bottom. I pulled out a long, heavy brass key engraved with the emblem of the First Fidelity Bank of town. By 9 in the morning, Clara and I were standing inside the quiet, carpeted vault of the local bank. The manager had verified my identity and left us alone in the small viewing room. I slid the brass key into the lock of the steel deposit box. Clara turned her key in the secondary slot. The heavy metal door popped open. Inside lay a single, crisp manila envelope. Clara carefully broke the wax seal and slid out a heavy parchment document. She unfolded it under the harsh fluorescent light of the vault. I leaned in, reading the dense legal typography. It was an original, notarized codicil to my grandmother's trust. A hidden addendum that Evelyn had either never known about or had deliberately chosen to ignore. "Read Section 4, Clara said, her voice vibrating with a dangerous, triumphant energy. I traced the text with my finger. The legal language was ironclad, written with a lethal precision. It explicitly stipulated that if the primary trust manager, Evelyn, was ever found to be deriving personal, unapproved benefit from the estate's assets, her managerial authority would be immediately and permanently revoked. The control of the trust would automatically transfer to the designated alternate supervisor. That alternate was Clara. Furthermore, the codicil contained a poison pill regarding any sale of the property. It mandated that no transfer of ownership could ever be legally executed via electronic signature or proxy. Any sale was only valid if Janet Spencer signed the final deed in person, physically standing in the presence of two specifically named, lifelong members of the historical board. The board members Evelyn had conveniently excluded from her inner circle. The entire chessboard flipped in a single heartbeat. Evelyn had not just violated the moral code of our family. In her arrogance, she had walked blindly into a steel-jawed legal trap my grandmother had meticulously set and buried 20 years ago. The fraudulent emergency power of attorney, the forged digital signatures, the secret liquidations, all of it was legally dead on arrival. I looked at Clara, a fierce, victorious smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. But Clara did not smile back. Her expression remained as grim and focused as a battlefield commander. "Having the right ammunition is not enough, Janet," Clara warned, carefully sliding the codicil back into the manila envelope. "If we walk up to Evelyn right now and slap this paper on the table, she will panic. She will call her lawyers, stall the proceedings, hide the financial ledgers, and spend the next 3 years tying you up in brutal probate litigation while spinning a story about a tragic misunderstanding. We cannot just block the sale." Clara looked me dead in the eyes, the fluorescent light reflecting off her silver hair. "We have to let them think they have won. We have to let them assemble their entire audience. We have to bring the hammer down at the exact second they try to strike the match, so there is no shadow left for them to hide in." I pulled the shared home tablet from my tote bag and set it flat on Clara's conference table. In his absolute arrogance, Reed had forgotten the golden rule of modern domesticity: devices sync. While he had meticulously scrubbed his personal smartphone, he had neglected the cloud backup automatically tethered to the tablet we kept in the living room for controlling the thermostat and streaming movies. Noah handed me a proprietary decryption cable. I linked the tablet to my computer, bypassed the standard user interface, and accessed the raw archive files. It took me exactly 14 minutes to find the ghost directory. It was a hidden messaging application disguised as a generic calculator widget. Reed had used it almost exclusively to communicate with Marcus Vance, his former fraternity brother and the chief executive officer of Solstice Haven Retreats. I opened the chat logs. The screen filled with lines of encrypted text that Noah's software rapidly translated into plain English. As I read the unspooling conversation, the air in the room grew entirely still. The betrayal I had witnessed through the sunroom glass suddenly felt juvenile compared to the breathtaking, sociopathic architecture of my husband's actual agenda. Reed had never loved my mother. He was not blinded by some twisted, forbidden passion. To him, Evelyn was nothing more than a highly efficient tool. I scrolled back to a conversation dated the second week of January. Marcus had asked Reed how he was handling the daily grind of sleeping next to his wife while actively courting his mother-in-law. Reed's response was typed out with brutal, casual cruelty. Evelyn is just the bridge, man. She is a vain, aging socialite, terrified of losing her looks and her relevance. I feed her a few compliments, pour her enough expensive wine, and she practically hands me the keys to the kingdom. Once the Juniper Point sale goes through, I am cutting both the mother and the daughter loose. A sickening cold spread from my chest to my fingertips. I clicked the next archived thread. Here, the two men discussed the financial mechanics of the sabotage. Reed was not planning to stick around and play the wealthy power couple with Evelyn. His exit strategy was already fully funded and mapped out to the final hour. He laid out the timeline with terrifying precision. As soon as Solstice Haven wired the non-refundable 7-figure deposit and the lucrative 6-figure consulting fee into a decentralized offshore account, Reed was gone. He had already placed a silent deposit on a sprawling, glass-walled bachelor estate in Scottsdale. He intended to pack a single bag, drive to the airport, and vanish. But he needed a scapegoat to absorb the legal fallout of the forged deeds and the stolen trust funds. His chosen victim was the very woman he was currently kissing in my sunroom. Evelyn's fingerprints are all over the digital transfer logs. Reed had texted Marcus. I used her laptop for the heavy lifting. When the authorities finally realize the signatures are fake, she takes the entire blast radius. I walk away completely clean. I will just tell the judge I was a naive guy caught in the crossfire of a toxic, wealthy family tearing itself apart over an inheritance. Noah stopped typing. Clara stared at the glowing screen. Her jaw set so hard the muscles ticked in her cheek. I kept reading. The worst messages were not about the money. The worst messages were about me. Marcus had expressed concern that I might figure out the corporate structure of Solstice Haven and file an injunction before the ink dried. Reed had assured him the psychological demolition was already handled. I have been feeding Janet her sleep medication and keeping her exhausted for months. Reed wrote, Evelyn is poisoning the well with the Heritage Board. If Janet tries to blow the whistle, everyone will just look at her and see a hysterical, overworked corporate drone having a complete nervous breakdown. Nobody believes a crazy woman. Marcus. They will practically thank us for taking the property off her hands. I pushed the tablet away. The screen went dark. My father had been standing behind my chair, reading the messages over my shoulder. He did not yell. He did not punch the wall. He simply sank into the nearest leather armchair, burying his face in his hands. The sound that escaped him was not a sob. It was a hollow, agonizing groan of a man watching his entire reality collapse into dust. Arthur realized the most pathetic, humiliating truth of all. Evelyn had not merely betrayed her only child for money or power. She had thrown away a 4-decade marriage and her daughter's soul for an absolute illusion. She genuinely, foolishly believed Reed was her second act. She thought she was the glamorous older woman running away with a handsome, younger partner after pulling off the ultimate high society heist. She was entirely blind to the fact that she was the primary target of the con. The tragic geometry of my family was finally exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the law office. My husband had ruthlessly exploited my mother's fragile ego and her deep-seated terror of aging. In turn, my mother had enthusiastically exploited my brutal work schedule, my infinite patience, and my fundamental belief that a mother would never actively destroy her own flesh and blood. They were two parasites feeding on each other, entirely unaware that the host had just woken up. I reached for my tote bag, my fingers brushing against the manila folder containing the drafted injunctions. File the block right now, I told Clara, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Freeze the title, lock the escrow accounts. I want the police waiting at the Scottsdale property by midnight. Clara slammed her hand down on the wooden table, stopping me instantly. Absolutely not. I stared at my aunt. my pulse hammering in my ears. They are stealing my legacy. He is framing her to take the fall. We have the proof. We have digital fragments and a hidden codicil, Clara snapped back, her eyes burning with the cold, strategic fire of a veteran litigator. If we strike today, if we file that injunction right now, Solstice Haven will instantly sense the legal exposure. Marcus Vance will dissolve the shell companies, pull the funding, and vanish into the corporate shadows. Reed will claim his tablet was hacked. Evelyn will play the innocent, confused wife. They will scatter like roaches when the kitchen light turns on, and the evidence of their collusion will never be fully exposed in a court of law. Clara leaned forward, resting both hands flat on the desk. You cannot just stop a bullet, Janet. You have to let the shooter pull the trigger in front of a crowd. I looked at the whiteboard where I had mapped out their timeline. The red ink circled one specific event, hovering just 48 hours away. The Founders Lantern Gala. It was Evelyn's masterpiece. She had invited every wealthy donor, every local politician, and every member of the Historical Society to the inn. She planned to stand on a stage, solicit donations for a fake conservation fund, and then quietly slip up to the second-floor library to sign away the property while the string quartet played in the ballroom below. A profound, chilling clarity washed over me. Clara was right. A private legal settlement was too clean. A quiet divorce was too merciful. I did not want to stop them in the shadows. I wanted them to step fully into the light. I wanted Evelyn to put on her expensive gown and her fake smile. I wanted Reed to adjust his tailored suit and play the charming son-in-law. I wanted them to climb the grand staircase to the library, fully believing they had won. This was no longer a simple equation of revenge. It was an execution. I was going to let them build their perfect, shining pedestal out of lies. I was going to let them climb to the very top. And then, right when the entire town was watching, I was going to shatter the foundation and let gravity do the rest. The air in the attic office shifted entirely from the suffocating weight of revelation to the cold, kinetic energy of execution. We had exactly 36 hours until the Heritage Gala commenced at Juniper Point. I stood at the head of the long wooden table, erasing the chaotic web of our emotional discoveries and replacing it with a rigid, minute-by-minute tactical timeline. We divided our counteroffensive into 3 distinct, synchronized strikes. We had to paralyze the digital transaction, legally decapitate the trust management, and systematically obliterate Evelyn's social armor in front of her most valuable audience. Clara retreated to her heavy oak desk, pulling a fresh legal pad from her top drawer. Her portion of the strike was purely judicial. She was drafting an emergency ex parte motion for the county judge. It was a direct petition to officially recognize the activation of the original codicil, formally transferring all supervisory rights of the estate from my mother to my aunt due to gross financial misconduct. I will have the judge sign this order in private chambers tomorrow afternoon, Clara stated, her pen scratching furiously against the thick paper, but I am absolutely not filing it with the clerk until the sun goes down. If Evelyn's attorneys catch even a whisper of this filing on the public docket before the gala begins, she will panic. She will pull the plug on the entire evening, lock down the property, and force us into a miserable 3-year probate war. Noah was pacing near the frosted glass windows, speaking quietly into his cell phone with his contacts at the county registrar. He was exploiting a bureaucratic loophole to lay a digital landmine beneath Reed's carefully planned closing. Because the inn was a registered historical landmark, any transfer of the deed required secondary municipal verification. Noah quietly instituted a hard technical block in the archiving system. "It is done," Noah announced, hanging up the phone and adjusting his thick glasses. I placed a strict routing hold on the parcel number. If the names on the final transfer deed do not perfectly match the specific 2-person witness protocol demanded by your grandmother's hidden addendum, the municipal software will automatically reject the digital filing. Even if Reed manages to get her to sign the papers upstairs, the county system will lock them out the second his escrow officer tries to upload the file to the state database. While the legal and technical traps were being set, my father took on the delicate, highly strategic task of ensuring the correct audience was present for the execution. Arthur sat in the deep leather armchair in the corner of the office, placing methodical phone calls to the most senior, influential members of the Heritage Council. He did not yell. He did not sound like a broken husband reeling from a catastrophic betrayal. He used the calm, lethal tone he normally reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "You will want to be in the main ballroom tomorrow evening. Richard," Arthur told the council president over the phone, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "There is going to be a significant, unannounced presentation regarding the permanent future of the property. I strongly suggest you do not miss the opening remarks." He offered just enough gravity to guarantee their attendance, but not a single specific detail that could accidentally warn Evelyn. My domain was the narrative. A legal victory was entirely insufficient if my mother could spin it into a tragic, sympathetic misunderstanding over mimosas at the country club the following week. I treated my mother and my husband exactly like a corrupt chemical conglomerate trying to cover up a toxic spill. I assembled a ruthless, airtight press kit. I compiled the financial ledgers Sadie had provided, highlighting the thousands of dollars drained for private cottage weekends. I attached the photographs of the antique furniture slapped with liquidation tags. I included the fraudulent medical evaluations, alongside the transcript of Reed's offshore banking plans and his purchase agreement for the property in Scottsdale. I loaded the damning files onto 2 encrypted flash drives. I contacted a trusted investigative reporter from the County Chronicle and a prominent local heritage blogger. I offered them the exclusive story of the decade under one absolute condition. They could not publish a single word, nor could they approach the property, until I sent them a specific 2-word text message. Meanwhile, back at the inn, Sadie and her most trusted staff members were fighting a quiet war in the shadows. They spent the night shift secretly downloading the last 90 days of security footage from the hallway cameras, securing visual, undeniable proof of Reed and Evelyn sneaking into the private waterside suites. They duplicated the master guest logs and made high-resolution scans of every internal catering invoice charged to the preservation fund. By dawn, Sadie texted me a single confirmation that the physical evidence was safely locked in the trunk of her car, completely out of Evelyn's reach. The entire operation hinged on a terrifyingly narrow, razor-thin margin of time. I stood before the whiteboard and pointed a black marker at the exact hour of the gala. I laid out the mechanics of the trap for my team. "Timing is everything," I explained, looking at Clara and Arthur. "If we strike too early, before the guests have their coats taken and their champagne glasses filled, Evelyn will simply cancel the event. She will claim a sudden migraine, send everyone home, and retreat into her mansion to fight us from the shadows. If we wait even 10 minutes too long, Reed will have the buyer's representatives in the second-floor library. The signatures will hit the physical paper, the earnest money will clear the wire, and reversing the fraudulent sale will take a decade of agonizing civil litigation." I paused, letting the weight of the strategy settle over the room. "We have to let her take the stage. I need her to stand in front of the elite members of this town, bathe in their applause, and confidently project her carefully crafted image of the selfless, sacrificing mother. I am not going to argue with her in the driveway. I am going to let her build her perfect, shining pedestal out of lies. And then, right when she reaches the top, we pull the floor out from under her." Fast forward to the evening of the gala. I sat entirely alone in front of a tall vanity mirror in a quiet hotel room on the edge of town. The digital clock on the nightstand read 6 o'clock in the evening. The event was scheduled to begin in exactly 1 hour. I reached for the dark navy blue dress hanging on the back of the closet door. Its architectural lines were sharp, tailored, and entirely devoid of anything soft or forgiving. I stepped into the heavy fabric, pulling the zipper up my spine with a smooth, decisive motion. I fastened my grandmother's vintage pearl earrings to my earlobes, the cold metal pressing sharply against my skin. I looked at my reflection in the glass. My eyes were completely clear, stripped of any lingering grief. The devastated, naive woman who had hidden behind the yew bushes in the driveway 48 hours ago was gone, burned away by the sheer velocity of their betrayal. I did not look like a heartbroken wife preparing to confront a cheating husband. I did not look like a wounded daughter. I looked like a senior executive stepping into a hostile boardroom, carrying the exact tools required to permanently close a crisis. The Founders' Lantern Gala bathed the sprawling grounds of Juniper Point in a warm, deceptive gold. Hundreds of paper lanterns were strung through the heavy branches of the ancient weeping willows bordering the lake, casting a soft, flickering glow over the manicured lawns. A string quartet was stationed on the wide wraparound porch, playing a gentle, melancholy waltz that drifted seamlessly over the quiet lapping of the water. It was an absolute masterpiece of high society staging. It was exactly the kind of theatrical, opulent arena my mother lived for. Every single detail, from the crystal champagne flutes to the embroidered linen napkins, was meticulously designed to project an image of pristine, enduring heritage. But walking up the gravel path, listening to the clinking glasses and the polite laughter, all I could smell was the sickening rot of their lies beneath the expensive perfume. Evelyn moved through the sea of wealthy donors and local politicians, like the undisputed queen of the historical district. She wore a stunning emerald green gown that caught the lantern light with every step, her smile wide and brilliantly practiced. She was in her absolute element, leaning in to whisper intimately with the town council members, touching their arms with perfectly manicured fingers. Right behind her, playing his supporting role to absolute perfection, was my husband. Reed looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal tuxedo. He was the picture of the devoted, charming son-in-law. He smoothly intercepted empty glasses, pulled out mahogany chairs for the elderly board members, and flashed that blindingly white, completely hollow smile. They looked like the perfect stewards of my grandmother's legacy. I stood hidden in the deep shadows of the coat-check vestibule, watching them work the room. The poison Evelyn had meticulously dripped into the ears of the Heritage Committee over the past 6 months had bloomed beautifully. I could hear the hushed, sympathetic whispers circulating among the tables. Women in diamond necklaces murmured about how tragic it was that I had pushed myself into a state of total collapse. I heard the phrase, "away on a restorative retreat," used at least 3 times. It was a brilliantly soft, elegant way of telling the entire town that I was mentally unstable and unfit to be seen in public. They were mourning my sanity while drinking the champagne I paid for. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, my father made his entrance. Arthur walked through the grand double doors entirely alone. He wore a severe black suit, his expression unreadable, radiating a cold, impenetrable gravity. I watched my mother's eyes lock onto him from across the ballroom. For a fraction of a second, her perfect, brilliant smile faltered. Her grip on her champagne flute tightened, her knuckles flashing white, but her arrogance quickly overrode her panic. She assumed Arthur was there to silently support her charade to avoid a public scandal. She gave him a stiff, brief nod and turned back to her donors. She had no idea she was looking at her own executioner. Clara did not make a grand entrance. She slipped in through the side conservatory doors like a ghost, blending instantly into the dimly lit edges of the room. She took a seat at a small, shadowed table behind the front rows, her face partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement. Meanwhile, Noah bypassed the main ballroom entirely. Wearing a standard black catering vest we had procured from Sadie, he carried a tray of empty glasses up the grand, sweeping mahogany staircase, vanishing onto the second floor to monitor the corridor leading to the private library. At 15 minutes past 8, the string quartet stopped playing. A hush fell over the crowd as Evelyn stepped up to the small, velvet-draped stage erected in the center of the room. She tapped her microphone, the sharp sound cutting through the warm air. She began her speech with a masterful, sickening display of manufactured emotion. She spoke eloquently about family history, about the profound sacrifices made by the generations before us, and about the solemn duty to preserve our town's legacy. "Sometimes," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a register of profound maternal sorrow, "preserving the past requires us to make agonizing choices in the present. It requires us to step up and protect the next generation from the crushing, overwhelming burden of difficult decisions. It was a flawlessly coded message to the audience. It sounded like a poetic tribute to stewardship. To me, it was the final, public justification for tearing my inheritance out of my hands. As the ballroom erupted into polite, sustained applause, I watched Reed move. He did not clap. He locked eyes with three men wearing sharp, dark suits standing near the bar, the representatives from Solstice Haven Retreats. Under the cover of the applause and my mother's sweeping bows, Reed gave a subtle tilt of his head. He turned and walked purposefully toward the grand staircase, escorting the corporate buyers up to the second floor. Upstairs, the heavy oak desk in the library was already prepared with the fraudulent transfer deeds, the forged medical proxies, a bottle of aged scotch, and an expensive fountain pen. My phone vibrated silently in my hand. It was a text message from Clara, relaying the intelligence Noah was feeding her from the upstairs hallway. The documents are out on the desk. Solstice internal witnesses are in the room. Only one final signature is left before the transaction runs. The timeline had reached its absolute breaking point. The trap was fully loaded. The target was standing directly on the center mark. On the stage, Evelyn signaled to a waiter to bring her a fresh glass of champagne. She raised the crystal flute high into the air, the lantern light catching the golden liquid. "To the bright, secure future of Juniper Point," Evelyn announced, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable victory. That was my cue. I stepped out of the shadows of the vestibule. I pushed the heavy, brass-handled oak doors would open. The hinges let out a low, resonant groan that sliced straight through the ambient noise of the ballroom. I walked out into the light. I was wearing the dark navy blue dress, my posture perfectly straight, my expression carved from solid ice. I did not storm into the room. I did not shout her name. I did not sprint toward the stage to rip the microphone from her hands. I simply stepped into the center of the main aisle, folded my hands calmly in front of me, and stood completely still. A woman at the nearest table gasped. The sound rippled outward like a stone dropped in a quiet pond. Heads turned. Conversations died instantly in the back of the room, then the middle, and finally the front. The silence spread like a fast-moving frost until the entire grand ballroom was dead quiet. Evelyn's arm froze mid-air. The triumphant smile slid completely off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The crystal champagne flute in her hand began to tremble violently, spilling golden drops onto the wooden floorboards. On the landing of the grand staircase, Reed had paused to look down at the sudden silence. When he saw me standing there, the color completely drained from his face. He grabbed the heavy wooden banister as if his legs had suddenly forgotten how to support his own weight. I looked up at my husband. Then I leveled my gaze directly at my mother, standing frozen on her stage. I did not need to say a single word. The total, paralyzing silence in the room spoke for me. I stood there, letting the reality wash over them, letting the cold, undeniable truth sink into their bones. They saw me. They saw that I was not broken, I was not medicated, and I was not hiding. And in that one, breathless moment, as the entire town watched in total silence, both of them realized there was absolutely no way back from the ledge they had just stepped off. While Evelyn remained utterly frozen behind the podium, her champagne flute still hovering uselessly in the air, Clara gave a single, sharp nod from the shadows. At that precise second, the heavy oak doors of the second-floor library were thrown wide open. Noah Briggs marched into the room where the Solstice Haven executives had just uncapped their expensive fountain pens. His voice, trained for loud, chaotic closing rooms, carried easily down the grand staircase and echoed across the vaulted ceiling. "This transaction is permanently blocked," Noah declared, slamming his hand flat against the polished wood of the antique desk. "The documentation does not meet the original witness requirements stipulated by the estate, and the municipal registrar has officially flagged the power of attorney for severe fraudulent discrepancies. Nobody signs anything tonight." Downstairs, Clara did not wait for the confused whispers of the crowd to begin. She stepped out from behind the towering floral arrangements and walked purposefully up the short steps to the stage. She did not look like an estranged sister. She looked like a Supreme Court judge delivering a capital sentence. Clara thrust a thick sealed folder directly against Evelyn's chest. "That is an emergency injunction signed by the county judge this afternoon, alongside the original codicil to the family trust," Clara announced. Her voice was unamplified, but carried a lethal clarity that reached every single Heritage Board member seated in the front rows. "Due to irrefutable, documented evidence of gross financial self-dealing and theft, your managerial authority over this estate is completely revoked. Legal control of Juniper Point has automatically transferred to me." Evelyn stumbled backward, her heel catching on the thick microphone cord. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the stage. I did not scream. I did not throw a drink in her face. I simply placed a heavy manila folder directly onto the podium in front of the microphone. I spread the contents out for the front rows to see. I laid out the high-resolution photographs of my grandmother's antique furniture plastered with yellow liquidation tags. I placed the internal ledger highlighting the thousands of dollars stolen from the preservation fund to finance Evelyn's secret romantic weekends. And finally, I dropped a heavy set of printed screenshots containing the forged medical declarations and the undeniable video stills of my mother and my husband tangled together in my sunroom. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit send on a prepared text message. From a small table near the back of the room, the investigative reporter from the County Chronicle stood up. He did not ask for permission to speak. "Mrs. Spencer," the reporter shouted, his voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating tension. "Can you explain why you solicited preservation funds tonight, when the Solstice Haven blueprints clearly mandate the demolition of the main house? And can you clarify why your daughter was suddenly declared legally incapacitated exactly 4 days before this secret unlisted sale was scheduled to close?" The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps, angry murmurs, and the scraping of wooden chairs as people stood up. Reed, who had been hovering near the landing of the staircase, realized the entire ship was rapidly sinking into the ocean. The polished, charming commercial broker vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified, cornered rat. He scrambled down the stairs, pushing roughly past a waiter, and pointed a shaking finger directly at my mother. "She orchestrated the entire thing," Reed yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic, desperately trying to salvage his own skin in front of the wealthy donors. "She forged the medical records. She locked Janet out of the accounts. She forced me to go along with it to save my career. I was just trying to help her." Clara let out a cold, sharp laugh that cut through the noise. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a stapled stack of paper. "We recovered your encrypted chat logs, Reed," Clara said, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "The ones where you explicitly laid out your strategy to drug my niece and make her look unstable. The ones where you told your buyer that Evelyn was nothing but a bridge, a vain, aging woman you planned to completely abandon in Scottsdale the second the escrow cleared. That was the blow that finally broke my mother. It was not the loss of the massive property, nor the looming threat of prison. It was the public, undeniable revelation that her grand, forbidden romance was a pathetic, humiliating illusion. Reed had never loved her. He had never desired her. He had merely looked at her and seen a gullible key to a vault he desperately wanted to rob. Evelyn covered her mouth, a harsh, guttural sob tearing from her throat as she collapsed against the wooden podium, her emerald dress pooling around her, before anyone in the room could offer her a single ounce of pity. My father stepped forward from the back of the ballroom. The crowd parted for him as if he were carrying a deadly plague. "Do not look at me for salvation, Evelyn," Arthur commanded, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. He looked at his wife of 40 years as if she were a total stranger. "I have officially revoked your access to all joint marital assets. The divorce filings will be served to you tomorrow morning. I have already contacted the district attorney, and I will fully cooperate with both the civil and criminal investigations regarding your massive real estate fraud and forgery." The three executives from Solstice Haven did not wait to hear another word. They grabbed their leather briefcases and practically sprinted out the front glass doors, abandoning the deal and their compromised broker to the wolves. The president of the Heritage Board stood up, his face flushed with fury, and publicly declared that Evelyn was permanently stripped of her chairman's status and banned from the council. The final, beautiful nail in the coffin came from the kitchen corridor. Sadie Monroe, her head held high and her eyes blazing, led a line of 6 uniformed staff members straight into the ballroom. They were pushing heavy wooden dollies loaded with my grandmother's vintage armchairs and cherrywood sideboards, the very items Evelyn had sworn were safe, completely exposing the physical reality of the liquidation plot right in front of the donors. I stepped up to the microphone. I looked at my mother, weeping silently on the floor, and my husband, backed into a corner by his own blinding greed. "This property is not a personal piggy bank," I told the silent, captivated room, my voice steady and clear. "Juniper Point will continue to operate exactly as it always has. Every single staff member will retain their position. Furthermore, the funds recovered from this fraudulent embezzlement will be used to establish a permanent hospitality scholarship in my grandmother's name." The knot inside my chest, the one that had been suffocating me for days, finally unraveled. My mother had lost her entire social empire. My husband had lost his professional reputation and his meal ticket. The fraudulent sale was completely dead and buried. But more importantly, I had not just taken back my legal rights and my money, I had stepped into the exact arena where they had planned to bury me, and I had rewritten the ending of my own story in permanent ink, right under the bright, golden lights they had set up for my funeral. Thank you all for listening to my story, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your location in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.